people.
Molt bé. Cronòmetres, aigua. Bueno, benvinguts i benvingudes en aquesta conversa amb Ash Sarkar. Moltíssimes gràcies per acompanyar-nos. Gràcies a la Literal una vegada més per organitzar aquests espais. Us la presento... Is it okay?
Yeah.
Us la presento per qui no la conegui. Ja sé que alguns de vosaltres la coneixeu per la feina que fa a Nova Media, però aquelles persones, sobretot, que no parlen anglès, potser és la primera vegada que accediu al seu pensament, a les seves reflexions. L'Ash és una periodista i una analista política anglesa. És cofundadora i editora d'un mitjà de comunicació independent que es diu Nova Media. I l'any passat va escriure el seu primer llibre, és aquest, que acaba de traduir, a més molt ràpid, per tant podem entrar realment en la conversa en la qual tu estàs també pensant ara, el seu llibre que es diu La tirania de la minoria, de les polítiques d'identitat a les guerres culturals. Llavors, per començar, Ash, és un plaer tenir-te aquí, haver conegut la teva feina en profunditat. Moltíssimes gràcies per escriure aquest llibre que, tot i les distàncies culturals, ens dona eines al nostre context per seguir pensant, vull dir que és superútil per nosaltres. I entrem directament ja en aquesta conversa. Per situar-vos tots una mica, l'Ash i els seus companys i companyes a Londres i al Regne Unit, igual que nosaltres, igual que tota la Fira Literal, s'estan fent les mateixes preguntes, que és com combatre l'extrema dreta de forma productiva i també què fer amb la sensació de paràlisi que a vegades ens envaeix i que estem tots una mica amb una dificultat i que, pel que veiem llegint-la amb ella, travessa tots els contextos. En aquest exercici es tracta una mica no només de què fem, sinó si som capaços i capaces de pensar i analitzar com hem arribat fins aquí i mirar-nos una mica. Llavors, em sembla molt interessant el fil conductor que tu proposaràs, llavors anem a desgranar-lo en aquesta conversa i anem a començar pel punt de partida on tu diries potser, per analitzar la situació actual, part del problema és la forma amb la qual les esquerres han conceptualitzat la identitat. És a dir, hi ha alguna cosa del que estem fent que és part del problema. Llavors, començant per aquí, et preguntaria, donant per descomptat que no cal allargar-nos, que, òbviament, la identitat com una forma d'assenyalar la desigualtat i la discriminació és molt important i combat el racisme, aquesta pantalla no estem aquí, però hi ha alguna forma amb la qual hem conceptualitzat això que és problemàtica. Llavors, comencem per preguntar-te per què, segons el teu anàlisi, ha esdevingut tan problemàtica.
Okay, well, I think maybe I'll start by telling a story, if that's all right. So, a few years ago, I was facilitating a big assembly. So the idea was that it was participative democracy. We were coming together as a movement to try and get to grips with where the left has gone wrong and what it is we need to do. And we invited speakers to offer provocations to get the conversation going. And one of those speakers was a guy called Roger Hallam, who co-founded Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, so he is a huge part of the climate movement in the UK. And to give you a bit of context for what Roger is like, he's like Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. He's got silver hair, he's very exasperated, he's like going to the hobbits, get the fuck out of, the Shire, there's something we've got to do. He's very urgent. So when I asked him the question, where has the left gone wrong, he looked out at these hundreds of activists and he looked really sad and he said, the problem is you're all a bunch of fucking cunts. And it unraveled from there. So people, I think, have a right to say, I don't like being spoken to like that. I find it vulgar, I find it offensive, I think that you are inhibiting our ability to work together. That's fine. What it is not is racist. Okay? The word cunt is not racially specific. But you had people saying white anger has been brought into this space. Someone said the problem is male anger. A young group of activists got together and after the break they said, we feel unsafe as people of color. Someone stood up in tears saying he brought violence into the space, that they'd been harmed by it, everyone had been harmed by it. And it really struck me that for a group of self-identifying radicals and revolutionaries who say that their aim is to one day take on the state and take on state violence, they couldn't cope with someone saying you're a fucking cunt. So there is this mismatch between the radicalism of your politics and the fragility of the self. And not just the fragility of the self, but the political self. And so that was, for me, a moment where a lot of things came together, where I realized that this identity focus had gone from understanding power, how does power operate, how does society operate, and instead had become a currency. I need to feel seen. I need to feel recognized. I need to feel centered in this space because if not, I'm unsafe. And we can go into where that developed from, but I think that that is a fundamentally neoliberal way of doing politics. It's something which doesn't come from the traditions of the left. It has nothing to do with Marxism, all right? Lenin, when they were storming the Winter Palace, wasn't going, oh, I feel a bit unsafe, right? In What Is to Be Done, he doesn't say, build a safe space free of microaggressions. It's something which comes from a neoliberal orthodoxy which is obsessed with the self. It comes from a particular kind of therapeutic language becoming really dominant amongst middle-class people. And it also comes from left-wing politics no longer being animated through working-class movements. Those politics are now something that people encounter at university. And I went to university, I did arts and humanities as well. I was a fucking nightmare, right? I always went, like, oh, pick me, like, I've got the answer. You know, you're trained to pick apart ideas. And so it was, we took that way of understanding politics and we did it to each other. Everything has to be interrogated and broken down and examined for harmful discourses, which is great in a seminar room. If you're trying to write an essay about Jane Austen, do that. But if you're trying to build a movement based on solidarity, possibility, different people coming from different walks of life and doing something together, it's completely toxic.
En aquesta reflexió que tu proposes i que ara hi entrarem, perquè crec que pots explicar-la d'una forma molt paradigmàtica, que és com aquesta manera de pensar la identitat ha estat ara capturada per l'extrema dreta. Abans de preguntar-te sobre això, et volia preguntar, i crec que en aquest llibre ho expliques molt bé, però crec que ets molt metòdica en l'anàlisi de però exactament quins són tots els efectes que produeix pensar la identitat d'aquesta manera. No? Llavors, a mi em sembla interessant perquè tu expliques molt bé que les polítiques sobre la identitat no sempre han sigut així. De fet, en els seus orígens, als anys 70, els primers activistes antiracistes, els primers activistes antiracistes negres, els primers moviments LGTB, no estaven basats en una lògica que deriva cap a un individualisme. Llavors, aquesta evolució em sembla molt interessant, si la pots explicar. I també em sembla molt interessant de quina manera tu expliques que d'alguna manera tota la conversa gira al voltant de l'experiència viscuda i no de la materialitat del dany. Què vols dir amb això?
I mean, so first, Foucault needs to be held accountable for everything he did, okay? You know, and don't get me wrong, I love a bit of Foucault, love a bit of discipline and punish, but that bald motherfucker, he introduced this idea of discourse. And again, it's useful in an academic setting, but it's a way of thinking about human interactions, not based on, I trust that you are who you say you are, and I trust that you mean the things you say. Instead, I'm looking for, what are the things you're really saying, even if you're not saying it? So again, here's an idea that emerges in the academy, and then we do it to each other. It's so mistrustful. But why did that idea become so hegemonic on the left? Well, it's because the engines of collective consciousness were systematically broken down from the 1970s onwards. Class consciousness is not organic, right? You can have an awareness of your circumstances, but for it to be a shared or collective subjectivity, you need institutions. So through the 20th century, those institutions were the trade union movement, heavy industry, which holds communities together, council housing and municipal housing, and of course actually existing communism in the form of the Soviet Union, which then disciplines capitalist economies here in the West. And all of those things were deliberately attacked and undermined and disintegrated. The trade union movement was attacked and disintegrated. In the UK, where I'm from, council housing was sold off. Deindustrialization meant that working class communities were fragmented and they became dispersed. And the sort of movements which were able to bring together class and race and class and gender, the CIA literally assassinated its leaders, right? Infiltrated it, undermined it, assassinated its leaders. So you have this breakdown of a kind of collective consciousness, and instead you have an individualist, atomized, suspicious, and hostile kind of consciousness, which then becomes dominant. So, taken through that lens, left-wing politics of identity, it transforms from a radical tradition, which is anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist and feminist and black radical and class and all of these things, and instead becomes about competing identities. So you used the phrase lived experience. Lived experience is, of course, an important way in which we come to understand each other. So you tell me what it's like for you to experience life. I learn about the world because you tell me. That doesn't mean that everything you say is right. And so if you're on the left, you've definitely encountered this. When someone starts a sentence saying, speaking as a Muslim, speaking as a woman of color, speaking as a, you know some bullshit is going to follow. Because it's a way of saying my identity transcends politics. My identity gives me a moral authority which transcends whatever political negotiation it is that we're trying to do. And lived experience goes from a testimony, and a testimony which should be taken seriously, to gospel truth. And I think I didn't mention this in the book because I only just thought of it. Which is, I think that the secularism and the secularization of society has a role here, which is politics is about tactics, and politics is about strategy, and politics is about being able to see something over there and trying to figure out how you get there. Then there are no universal tactics, right? There are tactics which work for now, and then you have to find another one. People can't cope with that kind of uncertainty. And so what they want are rules which apply in every single setting. So you always listen to the most marginalized person. So, if you're a woman of color, listen to them. If you're a woman of color who's also trans and disabled, jackpot, right? You want these rules which always apply. To which I say, you don't want politics. You want religion. And churches are open 24/7. You can find it any time.
Jo penso, quan et llegia i quan hem parlat abans i ara quan t'escolto, i segurament a molta gent li passa, que molta gent es deu preguntar aquest tipus d'anàlisi que crec que molta gent se li passa pel cap de tant en tant, ha de superar moltes fronteres per poder-se expressar dintre de l'esquerra. Hi ha moltes tensions, hi ha moltes dificultats per fer un anàlisi autocrític, molta prudència, i tu ho expliques ràpidament al llibre, no? Aquest argumentari d'aquest tipus de crítiques fan el joc a l'extrema dreta, aquest tipus de posicions d'alguna manera estan blanquejant el poder, i també aquesta cosa de la doble traïció de si qui fa aquestes crítiques és algú atravessat per aquestes desigualtats i forma part d'aquestes minories. Llavors, et volia preguntar com et col·loques en aquestes tensions i també pel que interpreto que potser en el context en el qual tu vius aquestes coses es poden començar a dir d'aquesta manera, cosa que també em sembla interessant, no? Que veiem un horitzó de no sempre aquesta conversa estarà tancada.
I mean, so if I understand you correctly, you're sort of suggesting that when you come up with this analysis, that you are seen as undermining the movement, right? And the thing that I'm trying to argue is that what has undermined the movement is this hyper-individualistic identity politics, right? It may as well have been invented by the CIA. It's that good at dividing us. So speaking out against it, it is not an act of treachery or betrayal of left-wing principles. It is actually upholding them. And so what I've tried to make clear in the book is that I'm not coming from an idea of class which says everyone is white, everyone is male, nobody is trans, nobody is disabled. We all are sort of the same, unimpacted by identity. I'm drawing from actually a black radical tradition, which begins with the Combahee River Collective, who were a group of black feminists from Boston who were writing in the 1970s. And they coined the term identity politics to be able to use their vantage point as black women who are at the bottom of the labor market to say this is how society works. And to sort of come back to this idea of how the left can sort of say, well, aren't you strengthening the far right by arguing that we reject identity politics? Well, no, because the thing that the far right actually hate is class politics. That they're very comfortable with an identity politics centered on whiteness. They're very comfortable with an identity politics centered around masculinity. They're very comfortable with an identity politics focused on homophobia and transphobia and all the rest of it. And in fact, if we say that the conflict which matters most is identity conflict, we're playing into their hands, because we don't all share an identity. And if we fixate on minority identities, guess what? We always lose the numbers game. Whereas if we talk about the fundamental economic struggle of which we are all a part, that cuts across race, that cuts across gender, that cuts across geography. And so for me, it's a betrayal of left-wing principles to suggest that class politics is, in fact, one form of identity dominating all the others. No, class is the spring from which exploitation and extraction comes, and it's because of that that we have racism, gender oppression, so on and so forth. So we have to go back to that origin, because it gives us a way of dealing with these other struggles.
Una de les teves reflexions, i que abans deia, expliques d'una forma molt paradigmàtica en el context britànic, i nosaltres podem buscar els nostres paral·lelismes, sent que tota aquesta conversa està travessada perquè hem de fer l'exercici de la traducció cultural de que el context britànic és diferent al nostre, però hi ha comuns denominadors i segurament estadis d'aquests processos en moments diferents. Una de les teves principals aportacions, jo sento, que té a veure amb dir, bueno, no només és que és problemàtica aquesta forma de pensar la identitat, bueno, per començar, expliques molt bé per què genera escenaris de crueltat entre nosaltres, perquè ens maltractem, perquè és una posició ètica problemàtica aquesta manera de mirar l'altre, per moltes coses que podem desenvolupar. Però sobretot diràs perquè, a més, no és efectiva, sinó que fins i tot és contraproduent perquè ha produït les eines amb les quals ara l'extrema dreta ens està torturant. I aquesta cosa de com la dreta ha après a explotar la nostra política del jo i de la víctima, fent una cosa que tu explicaràs com una autèntica revolució en la seva propaganda, és algo sobre el que et vull preguntar. És a dir, com l'extrema dreta, partint del nostre imaginari de la identitat i de la víctima, ha construït una paranoia on ells s'han inventat una identitat minoritària. I llavors, voldria que expliquessis aquest cas paradigmàtic que tu analitzes i que, de fet, s'explica bé amb com el context britànic, i podem trobar paral·lelismes aquí, s'ha mogut de quina manera pensava abans la classe treballadora i com la pensa ara, i com aquí es reflecteix que han après molt ràpid de nosaltres i ara són molt millors que nosaltres en fent política identitària.
I mean, so thinking about the way in which the right have used identity politics to great success, in the UK, there used to be something called the chav. Has anyone heard of chavs before? I'll explain it for those who aren't super familiar with early 2000s English slang. Chav was a way of talking about working class people who tended to be white and saying that they were disgusting. They were uneducated, they listened to hip hop, they wore, tracksuits, they had caps, and they had, a really aggressive dog. All right, that was the chav. And you could not open a newspaper without reading something about chavs. And journalists would refer to them as fat-gutted sluts. They would refer to them as dismal ineducables, basically so stupid, what's the point of educating them, right? It's going to go nowhere. And that was the dominant way of thinking about working class people when I was growing up. And that reflected the ideology of the time. At that time, there was the big myth of social mobility. So if you just get an education, if you just go to university, you can make it. And it doesn't matter that the council housing got sold off. It doesn't matter that there are no jobs in the town where you live if you're a working class man anymore because the factory got shut down. Just get an education, get up and go. Then the financial crisis, right? 2007, 2008. There is no more social mobility. If you did not get on the train, you are not going to become middle class afterwards. You know, it's left the station without you. And so you see a switch. People stop talking about chavs and they start talking about the white working class. So the same people who were condemned as disgusting, impossible to educate, and in fact, they were seen as being too close to black people and ethnic minorities. There used to be this satirical show called Little Britain with a character who was a chav, and she had 10 babies all in a pram at once, and they all had different races, right? So, you know, one was black, one was Asian, one was Chinese, one was white, because that was a way of demonizing white working class women, saying, look at them, they, you know, not only are they sluts, they sleep with men of color. What could be more disgusting? And so a switch happened. And I talk about in the book the exact same journalists, and I'm not talking about journalists as a class, individuals who had written articles talking about how disgusting chavs were now saying the white working class had been left behind. And so this is what I mean by identity politics. It is a politics which is centered on the question of who am I, who are you, and what is the competition between us. Because the white working class is only ever invoked to talk about how anti-racist initiatives have gone too far, or everyone's too obsessed with LGBT now, they've left behind the white working class. People don't talk about the white working class to say, actually, they got mega fucked over by neoliberalism. No one says, oh, the white working class, they've been completely failed by 40 years of housing policy. It's only ever brought up to say, oh, do you think we talk about slavery too much? And so this is part of the point of the book, which is that identity has become the master frame through which all politics is being pulled. And the far right have done very well out of it. But another thing which I want to talk about is that it's not just the far right and it's not just the left. The center does identity politics as well. So since 2023 and the beginning of the genocide, you have seen an escalation of a particular strategy being used by Israel's advocates around the world. They say, wherever you have pro-Palestine mobilization, it makes Jewish people feel unsafe. And the evidence for that is often very flimsy. So there is an organization called UK Lawyers for Israel who, wherever there is any kind of expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people, they say, oh, we've seen complaints from Jewish people, we feel unsafe. So there was a hospital forced to take down children's paintings from children in Gaza, because apparently that was making people feel unsafe. There's no evidence that anyone actually made a complaint. So it's not necessarily that you have a wave of a feeling of unsafety. You do have those feelings, but you also have a situation where the specter of those feelings is enough to try and close down on expressions of solidarity. But this has been taken up by the center. So this idea, well, there is a competition here between Jewish feelings of safety in the diaspora and being able to express horror and opposition to the genocide, that is an identity politics of the liberal center. And it ties the left up in knots because obviously no one wants to make people feel unsafe. That's a shitty thing to do. But we have not come up with a language, or I think we're struggling to come up with a language which can organize priorities, where we can say, yes, people's feelings matter, but people's feelings aren't always reality. And in fact, we live in a shared reality where we can agree on what's important based on material urgency. So there is a genocide going on. There is ethnic cleansing going on. That's really important. Another way of thinking about it is there is a housing crisis going on. There is a crisis of over-policing of working class communities going on. There is a climate crisis going on. So maybe someone mispronouncing your name at university can take a back seat. I mean, I don't know, whoever clapped definitely mispronounced my name. But it's a way of just saying, let's recenter on material harms, because that gives us a political orientation, which can, I think, defang the far right, who are using identity politics, and the centre, who are also using identity politics.
Trobo interessant també que part de la teva reflexió té a veure amb dir, més enllà de que els hi és molt efectiu, diguéssim, fer servir aquest tipus de mecanismes, també té a veure amb que les forces del poder, l'extrema dreta, però no només l'extrema dreta, sinó com tu veus tot un establishment que opera al voltant d'una certa estructura de societat, la cosa més perillosa que nosaltres podríem fer i que més l'amenaçaria és que ens ajuntéssim entre nosaltres. Això és realment la cosa més terrorífica que podem fer i més amenaçadora pel poder, és que de cop establíssim no aliances, sinó solidaritat. I en aquest sentit trobo interessant perquè tu proposes diverses vegades aquesta frase de Margaret Thatcher que ella diu l'economia és el mètode, però l'objectiu realment és el cor i l'ànima. És a dir, que aquesta gent no se n'adoni que té coses en comú. I em sembla interessant, sí, i voldria preguntar-te si pots explicar les vegades en el context del qual tu vens, on això ha estat a punt de passar, les revoltes que hi ha hagut a Londres, en molts barris, on de cop les qüestions de desigualtat han passat per sobre de qüestions més identitàries i on realment aquí el poder ha dit si jo no aconsegueixo separar aquesta gent, serà perillós. I em fa pensar també en el que hem vist a Minnesota amb l'ICE. Què ha passat quan la gent que ha considerat que s'havia de revoltar contra aquestes forces expulsant a la gent de les seves ciutats han sigut una comunitat de gent molt diversa. Llavors et podria preguntar com també en el context britànic el poder també se n'adona és que aquesta gent està començant a veure que té moltes coses en comú i com opera l'estigmatització també de la gent blanca quan comença a aliar-se d'altres formes amb els altres.
Well, I mean, there's stuff that we can learn from a British context, and there's stuff that we can learn from an American context. And I don't think that it will play out in the same way everywhere, but it's sort of, you extrapolate from it. So I actually want to go back to thinking about the 1970s and the Black Panther Party. So the Black Panther Party, you're thinking of Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis. What's really important about these individuals is that they're communists. So yes, they're talking about racism, but they're also thinking about US imperialism. They're also thinking deeply about class politics and a program which can connect the US to Vietnam, from the US to connections with the Soviet Union. All these things are being joined together. And there was an individual called Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was 21 years old when he was murdered by the Chicago police with the help of the FBI. And the reason why he was murdered is he was working on something called the Rainbow Coalition, where the Black Panthers were working with Puerto Ricans, were working with poor white people from the South of America, and they were successful in building this coalition which was centering the fact that if you are working class, regardless of whether you're black or whether you're white, you are first up for the draft to be sent to Vietnam, to be put on the front lines, and to be put into a meat grinder, and mauled by the Viet Cong. But then instead of saying, and our real enemy is the Viet Cong, they organized with representatives and delegates from Vietnam to burn draft cards. So this connection, which was spanning race and geography, was centering class and a class experience of the military-industrial complex, and then pulling in an anti-imperial dimension as well. And so that's one way in which you can see this organized cross-race, cross-identity effort as being incredibly dangerous to the status quo. But there are also disorganized expressions of that as well. So in 2011 in the UK, a black man was killed by the police called Mark Duggan. And it happened right at the time as austerity was being pushed through by the government. So welfare was slashed, public services slashed, education, healthcare, everything, you name it. So the rioting started in a black working class neighborhood, which is where I live, Tottenham, center of the universe. I should also say, if anyone can keep an eye on the Everton-Tottenham score, that would be so great. Don't tell me if we're losing, just tell me if we score. I've completely forgotten what I was saying. Riots. So the rioting began there, but it spread across London, and it spread from London across England. And it was not just people of color rioting. It was young working class white people as well. Why is that? Yes, they will have experienced violent policing as well, right? Like young white working class people don't have a great time with the cops, right? It's not just people of color that have a bad time with the cops, but also because it was a way for that anger to be expressed. And the elites of the UK were so puzzled by the fact that young white people were coming out to riot. A historian called David Starkey went on TV and he said it's happening because the whites have become black, as if you can catch it. And it was fascinating to me that they were almost getting to something true, which is if you create shared socioeconomic conditions between white people and black people, the racial distinction doesn't matter so much between them. They will see the self in the other. And that's why creating the white working class was so important. So, I'm not an anarchist anymore. I had my flirtation with anarchism. I thought, yes, we will just occupy one more bank and then revolution. It didn't happen, right? I'm now, in my old age, a Stalinist. Not really, but I believe in the state. I think that you have to have an organized expression of that kind of cross-race, cross-identity, cross-geography movement building. Because disorganized expressions, they lose out to whatever is more organized. Vincent Bevins writes about this really, really well. But in both examples, you see that this was such a threat to the status quo. And it makes me think that if we on the left are not just entertaining divisive identity politics, but we're pointing to it as a way forward, give up now. Right? Like we will never, ever succeed. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the capitalist culture has been so keen to reflect back identity politics to us, right? Like there was a time where on Nike adverts you couldn't move for Colin Kaepernick and them pretending that they were in favor of Black Lives Matter. Why? They didn't care about black people. Or no, they liked the black people who were working in the sweatshops to make their shoes. But they didn't have any sense of the inherent value. It was a way of signaling we're okay with this. They don't actually signal a class politics. I mean, can you imagine a Nike advert celebrating trade unions? Like how crazy that would be. You can have a diverse ruling class. Like that's not scary to anyone. What is scary is the idea that the ruling class might one day be annihilated.
Totes les converses ens porten als mateixos llocs que tenen a veure, potser hem de veure com, efectivament, desplacem algunes converses per recuperar la centralitat d'unes altres i, en aquest cas, al voltant de la classe social. Llavors, en aquesta conversa, també em sembla interessant la teva reflexió de cuidado amb apropar-nos a la qüestió de la classe des de la identitat. I llavors també reflexiona sobre com l'esquerra està ben tensionada en apropar-se realment a la qüestió de la classe sense reproduir un imaginari de la classe que té més a veure amb la seva expressió cultural que amb la seva materialitat. No? I em sembla que ets molt clara a dir, bueno, podem tenir una conversa teòrica molt complexa i té molts matisos, però potser també hem de trobar la forma d'aclarir-nos entre nosaltres i d'establir què volíem dir amb això de la classe. No? Llavors, sembla fàcil, però trobo que tens una manera bastant accessible d'entrar en aquesta conversa.
I mean, I suppose there is a thing to add on here, which is I'm not arguing that in order for the left to succeed, everyone should say whatever slur they want. All right? You don't get a slur as a treat. Not even the one you're thinking of right now. Instead, one of the things I'm talking about, because identity is important, racial supremacy is real and the effects of it are real. Transphobia is real and the effects of it are real and they're material. The same with sexism, the same with ableism. It's saying, how do we create a culture of solidarity and trust where there is significant difference? And there are so many examples that we can take from history. One is the Black Panthers. Another is thinking about the miners' strike of 1984 in the UK, where there was significant support coming from basically young lesbian and gay people from the cities who were getting buses up to, coal towns, pit towns in the North and the Midlands to support the miners. And there's a great film about this called Pride. And what you have is this understanding of the humanity of the other that comes from you've showed up in struggle with us and for us. And not everyone uses the right language, but instead of this veneer of politeness, what you have is a much more profound sharing of humanity. And I think that this can help us orient our demands a bit better when we're thinking about identity-based forms of justice which are important. So in the UK, we are in the grip of a transphobic backlash, which is fucking insane. Like, the government has now said that trans women have to use male toilets and trans men have to use female toilets, no matter what they look like. So some Bella Hadid-looking woman has to go into the men's toilets now because the government says so. That's crazy. And I think there's a way of creating a shared ethical world without actually having to change anyone's mind about what they think about gender. And there's a simple one, which is nobody wants more rules. Right, the government, in doing transphobia, is creating more rules that makes everyone more restrained. Nobody wants to set themselves up as the fucking toilet police. Nobody wants that. Like, we want to be governed by a common sense set of norms. And I think that's a way of us putting trans rights at the heart of something that everybody shares. Not everyone is trans. Not everyone believes in self-ID. Not everyone believes that gender is a social construct. That's fine. But what 99% of people can agree on is we don't want new rules. And so I think that there has been a tendency, and again, this comes from liberal identity politics, is we want to emphasize what's different. And I understand the temptation. We want to say, this is my experience, and it's real for me, and I want you to acknowledge that. But that's sometimes a bad basis for political change. You don't get that thing of the shared humanity. Where if we go like, look, I'm trans, you don't get it, that's fine, but both of us want to live in a world where no one really gives a shit, right? No one gives a shit, and we don't have toilet police, and we don't have these new and intrusive rules. You can get somewhere from that. And so I think that if we're thinking about what is it the left has to do, one is projects where you are brought into real-life contact with people who are not like you. And you can do that through a tenants union, you can do that through a community organization, you can do it through a political party, you can do it by organizing your community over something as small as we need more streetlights or whatever. And it's not necessarily the cause that's important, although obviously housing is useful because it animates that class consciousness. But it's just about getting people in a space where they realize we can do things with each other. We have agency when we're relying on each other. And then the second thing is, because I think this naturally follows on from real-life people in real-life spaces, the second thing is going, how do we articulate specific demands in a way which is universal? Or as majoritarian as possible, which always speaks that language of what benefits me benefits you. That, my perspective is part of a shared moral, ethical, and political universe that you also live in. And that's challenging, and it's more of an art than a science. You have to make some mistakes, and sometimes you will get it wrong. But I think that we can see where left projects are succeeding in the world, like Zoran Mamdani. He's got a gift for that. He knows how to articulate the specific within the context of the majoritarian and universal.
Ara que et sento dir això, a mi em sembla que, no sé com ho penses tu, però escoltant-te penso que segurament tens un punt de vista similar, però penso que al voltant d'aquesta conversa no va només de la ineficiència de segons quines estratègies polítiques o de que al final estan oblidant que la importància és com ens trobem en unes majories per combatre aquestes estructures de poder, sinó que també crec que part del que tu estàs plantejant i que comparteixo és que ens hem de fer càrrec de que les nostres subjectivitats també estan sent transformades pel poder. És a dir, que la nostra manera de fer política no està en un a fora on el neoliberalisme no ha impactat, l'individualisme no ha impactat. És a dir, quan nosaltres fem servir xarxes socials, no les podem fer servir sense que el propi algoritme transformi la nostra manera de pensar. Llavors, em sembla que aquí també hi ha una cosa que també és quasi una posició ètica en l'esquerra de la humilitat de reconèixer que part del que jo estic intentant combatre a mi també em configura i, per tant, també ho estic reproduint. I probablement la dificultat d'acceptar l'altre en el seu fracàs de ser moralment perfecte comença per la persecució de mi mateix i la incapacitat de reconèixer en mi mateix que nosaltres també som un resultat del liberalisme. La incapacitat que tenim per organitzar-nos és perquè també estem colonitzats per aquesta força. I em sembla que hi ha com una conversa ètica també al voltant d'això que tu planteges, que és, bueno, és que com mires a l'altre també té a veure amb com t'estàs mirant a tu. Si nosaltres pensem que això a nosaltres no ens afecta, que nosaltres tenim una manera pura d'accedir a això i que no podem acceptar que part del que hem de combatre per començar, d'on ve la paràlisi? Bueno, que nosaltres també estem atrapats en el desig de ser representats d'unes certes maneres, de ser vistos, no? I em sembla que aquesta part més ètica de la subjectivitat em sembla important i penso que tu també l'estàs abordant, tot i que potser no és l'epicentre del que planteges, però té a veure amb, bueno, però com estem mirant aquest altre, no? Com li estem parlant a l'altre.
I mean, I think the point that you made is a really important one, which is basically we're all neoliberal subjects. So no wonder we're struggling to do socialism. You know what I mean? Like, we're products of, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had children, and that's all of us. So no wonder we are finding this difficult to do. Let's just take social media for a second. Billions and billions and billions of dollars is being spent every single year to make sure I can't put down my phone, right? I am not more powerful than those billions of dollars. It is designed to be addictive. It is designed to bypass my own awareness of myself, so I keep looking like this, right? And so what they've learned is that, like any addictive substance, you turn to it the more atomized and lonely and unmoored from life you are. So it causes the problem and it presents itself as the solution. And I do this all the time, right? I call Twitter my phone cigarette. Like, I know it's bad for me, and I open it up and I'm like, I can feel the brain cells dying every single time I use it, because it's designed to offer itself as a form of self-soothing. The same with consumerism, right? I go onto Zara or other stories or whatever else it might be when I feel shit about myself and I think, well, what if I just scroll something and I buy something? I'm in a sort of anxiety-soothing addiction cycle with consumerism. And that has a huge impact in terms of how I interact with people. So social media makes you a brand ambassador for yourself. And every single day, you see other people's reputation and brand being completely destroyed. And we're social beings. We are literally biologically programmed to rely on one another for survival, right? We don't have claws, don't have fangs. All we have is each other to survive in the wild. So when we see ostracism on social media every day, we're kind of seeing people get murdered, right? Even though it's symbolic, we are seeing someone cast out of the circle, and it makes us really afraid. And what do we do when we're afraid? We either want to hide in the crowd, or we become sort of super anxious and super aware of everything we're doing and become paralyzed because of it. Or you get those people who go, well, fuck you, I never needed you anyway, I'm going to alienate myself before you can ostracize me. And then we're taking that into our real life experiences. And I also think that there is a dimension to which the left's absorbing of the tenets of liberalism has meant that we've become very bad at saying this is good for people, this is bad for people. Because instead we go, well, we shouldn't judge, everyone can make their own choices. When I'm getting my phone out my pocket to have my phone cigarette and check Twitter, I am not making a choice. I am in the throes of an addiction. And so the only model that works literally in the world for helping people overcome addictive behaviors, compulsive behaviors, is 12 steps. It's creating a system of social accountability where everyone is responsible for helping each other change. And liberalism can't do that, right? It cannot do that because it says, well, your choice is your own. And I do think, and I recognize that there is a version of this which is very shaming and very stigmatizing. But one of the reasons I think that feminism is struggling to re-articulate itself and it's gone so far down the rabbit hole of transphobia, at least in the UK, is because we have nothing credible to say about pornography. Because when it comes to thinking about pornography, you're either a liberal or pro-censorship. So either saying everyone makes their own choices and we mustn't stigmatize, or you are someone who stigmatizes sex workers and you say you are outside of the circle of a feminist organization. And actually there is another thing, where again we can start thinking about how corporations have preyed on us. So I'm not talking about sexual image making, which is the product of the free association of human beings who kind of like how they look that night and want to share that with the world. I'm talking about OnlyFans, which says the only value a woman has is as a commodity, but don't worry, she gets to set the price. And it replicates the model of social media. And it says, look, there's a hop and a skip and a jump from Instagram into making porn of yourself in your own bedroom. And that's freedom. No, it's not. It's training women to make sex objects of themselves and to be viewed as sex objects by other men. You know, having a woman as a subscription service is not feminism. And we've been unable to say that and to make that critique and to link it back to atomization and to loneliness and alienation, because we have kidded ourselves into thinking that either we are authoritarians who are stigmatizing and excluding of sex workers, or we're liberals who say anything goes. Like, no, we're Marxists. We have serious things to say about corporate power.
Estem apropant-nos en l'últim estadi d'aquesta conversa i volia també introduir una altra qüestió que pot semblar per un moment que ens allunyem una mica del tema, però penso que és fonamental i que expliques molt bé, que és introduir en totes aquestes converses què hi té a veure la crisi del periodisme. Que penso que no estic segura si les nostres esquerres estan prenent suficientment seriosament les conseqüències dramàtiques que té de perdre de vista la importància que té en una societat, en una democràcia, en un context on volem combatre les estructures de desigualtat, el poder, que hi hagi periodistes independents. No? Llavors, tu no només has fundat un mitjà independent, sinó que circules habitualment per diversos platós de televisió al context britànic, escrius pel Guardian, pel Telegraph, o sigui, estàs molt activa en aquests circuits i has desenvolupat també una crítica molt forta als periodistes polítics i a la seva responsabilitat de deixar que això passi, també a la precarietat avui del periodisme, que és un context de freelance majoritàriament, on les grans redaccions han fet acomiadaments massius. I t'ho volia preguntar també perquè la Literal penso que també està intentant entrar en aquesta conversa. Ahir la periodista palestina Mariam Barghouti estava en aquest mateix escenari i ella, des de la seva perspectiva d'haver estat informant del genocidi des de Cisjordània, analitza també molt bé els periodistes que podem considerar que no són tan importants o que tothom té un telèfon i pot fer un post d'Instagram i tampoc és tan diferent. Explicar, si no fos tan diferent, per què l'estat d'Israel assassina determinadament periodistes palestins sense parar i què passa si no tenim periodistes, però els palestins poden fer vídeos a les xarxes socials i hem vist tothom el genocidi en directe i Mariam Barghouti dirà, sí, i això què ha produït que tothom veiéssim un genocidi en directe sense periodistes, sense context, sense informació? La catarsi, la paràlisi, diguéssim, si nosaltres no podem accedir a la informació més que amb l'avalanxa que l'algoritme produeix, senzillament ens destrossa. I per tant ella deia, jo entenc perfectament que la gent mirant els vídeos del genocidi que hi ha un moment on és que no pots superar aquest sentiment. Llavors em sembla interessant perquè crec que tu et prens molt seriosament quina relació hi ha entre una societat... Què passa si una societat no té periodistes? Quina relació hi ha entre el periodisme, la democràcia i el pensament crític? I llegint-te veia que no estic exactament segura si el nostre context ha arribat als estadis on el periodisme, sobretot el periodisme polític, el context britànic ha arribat, però sens dubte el que tu descrius és una cosa completament terrorífica. I llavors et volia preguntar sobre exactament quina és la teva reflexió sobre el que passa al context britànic respecte a l'accés al periodisme i la degradació de la figura del periodista i per què consideres que és fonamental que l'esquerra tingui una conversa sobre això i li doni molt de valor. Un segon, està funcionant el micròfon? No. No. Gràcies.
It's on.
Ahora.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, because we're all good Marxists and we understand dialectics, there is a contradiction in the work that I do, which is on the one hand, journalism is really important for consciousness raising. And when you're thinking about why is it that Israel is murdering journalists in Gaza, there are hundreds and hundreds of journalists who've been deliberately targeted in drone strikes by Israel. They've also been detained, they've been tortured, they've been assassinated. Why is that? It's because we know that the flow of information is, yes?
Sí.
Is hugely politically powerful, right? We know this to be true. And also, information and the sort of saturation of information that we live with every day through social media and digital devices is also paralyzing. So there is a contradiction at the heart of being a left-wing journalist, which is that on the one hand, yes, you are trying to build up people's critical faculties, you're trying to politicize, you're trying to put them in contact with the reality of the world, and yet the method by which you are distributing that information, right, it's digital, like it has to be now, is keeping people inside and atomized and sort of in that state of being frozen. And I don't have a solution to that. I think instead what it's worth doing is thinking about the kind of movement ecology that the left needs. Navarra can't do it all. Journalists cannot do it all. We can say this is the state of the world, and we reflect that through the work that we do. We reflect that through being in contact with journalists in the West Bank as much as we can with journalists in Gaza. But there has to be a movement which is ready to catch people and ready to put that anger to good use. And I think that, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I've been thinking about the role of social media with the Gaza genocide, which is what you're seeing on social media every day is a scream from the heart for recognition, right? It's something which I think you cannot make neat and pretty and say, here is the purpose. It is people saying, if we can do nothing else, we can make you watch while we die. And there is something in that which is so, so raw. And weirdly, having a structure of processing that information because of the work I do has made it manageable. People often say, oh, how do you cope when you're looking at this imagery all the time? It's actually fairly simple when you have a show that has to go out every night because you're in the workflow. The thing which is difficult is people that don't have a project. So they're looking at that footage and they are having the kind of nervous system response that you have to looking at that footage, and it's actually it's beginning to inhibit their ability to do something political with it. And so I think that that's where events like this are really important, but also for those of you who are involved in some kind of collective organizing, whether it's political party or whether it's something more local or whether it's BDS, that's really important because you've got to catch people right when they're politicized, but before they fall into despair. And it's tricky with timing, tricky.
També em sembla interessant, i de fet en la conversa que tenien ahir l'Anna Gabriel i l'Alba García Linera va aparèixer aquesta conversa també, que és com aquesta pròpia dinàmica de la necessitat de ser viral, no? De molts periodistes d'esquerra. O sigui, per començar, la conversa entre no és el mateix un activista que un periodista, i un periodista, tot i que sigui d'esquerres, ha de poder preguntar-li, a la nostra societat ara, en el nostre país, es dona paradigmàticament un cas així, un polític important del centre-esquerra ha estat acusat de corrupció. Bé, doncs, què fan els periodistes d'esquerres davant d'això? Com es relacionen amb l'esquerra en el poder? No? Això és una qüestió que em sembla que és important, però crec que tu també expresses molt bé com la pròpia dinàmica dels propis periodistes, alguns dels que estan aquí, els nostres companys i companyes, que per poder existir necessiten accedir a la dinàmica de la viralitat. Llavors, encara que no ho vulguin i per sortir d'una dinàmica hiperprecària, suposo que a Nou Ara també us deu passar, és una cosa hipercomplexa que d'alguna manera, i això és el que es comentava ahir a la tarda, era molt interessant perquè d'alguna manera també ha atrapat a la pròpia classe política d'esquerres. És a dir, que els nostres polítics i polítiques d'esquerres també estan atrapats amb departaments de comunicació més grans que assemblees d'estratègia política. Més important el tall viral, més important la frase que he de dir que, vale, però com estic analitzant el que passa? Llavors, com això, d'alguna manera, que no està tan allunyat de la dinàmica de la política identitària, està produint també una dificultat, una trampa en la qual fins i tot quan les esquerres arriben a les posicions on poden fer coses, estan atrapades amb aquesta dinàmica d'exhibir el que estan fent del curt plaç, de ser accessibles amb la viralitat que tenen.
So I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're thinking about media being a trap that left-wing politicians fall into, and there is a sort of uneasy relationship between left-wing journalists and left-wing politicians. Am I right in getting you there? You're right that there is a trap. And so one of the things I write about in the book is that because neoliberalism made the role of democracy so much smaller, right? So if you're an elected politician, you say, oh, no, housing, that's for the market to decide. Okay, no, the financialization of entire economies, which means there's hundreds of trillions of dollars up here being gambled with in a global casino that no taxman can reach, that's for the markets, right? My job as a politician is to stand at the lectern and say, fewer immigrants next year. Right? That's it. The role of the politician has been made small by neoliberalism, which means that they have become pundits. Right? And it's so embarrassing in the UK. I don't think any of you can imagine how embarrassing it is to be British. Like, it's so difficult. I saw Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, talking about when Will Smith was slapped at the Oscars. And I thought, build some high-speed rail, you little bitch. Like, what are you doing talking about these things? And it's because he's become essentially a media figure. His role is to be like, I am the big talker. I am the most important talker in the country. And that's all they fucking do is talk. And that's actually a part of why the far right have become so popular in the UK, is because people all agree, whether you're on the left or on the right, politicians don't do anything. And in part, that's because they've become creatures of the media. Which then you go, well, how does left-wing media relate to this? One is, I think, you have to have truth discipline. So it's no good being a propagandist. And I'm not slagging off propaganda. I just think it's someone else's job, right? It's not my job. I want there to be good propagandists out there. But for us, the role is truth discipline. The right don't have truth discipline when it comes to their political interests. We actually have to have some truth discipline even when it comes to ours. Because the thing that we want to do is not develop an audience of fans, right? I am a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. I am a fan of Claudia Scheinbaum, or I am a fan of whoever else it might be. We want to have you be critical thinking, active leftists, which means we abide by truth discipline so that you are grappling with the reality of things and not just what you want to see and what you want to hear. The second thing that you absolutely have to do is have a funding model which allows you a degree of editorial independence. Now, editorial independence is never absolute. Like, we don't have billionaire funders. To be fair, none of them have offered. And so I would see if we could be persuaded if one did. But we don't have billionaire funders, we don't have paywalls, we don't have venture capital. Instead, we have lots and lots of small donations. Now, that keeps us with a degree of independence because we don't have someone calling up, you know, me or Aaron Bastani being like, I really fucking hated that article, say goodbye to all your money, right? That means that we can sort of do what we like. But there is still a way in which we are constrained by our audience, because when we do say things that our audience doesn't like and they yank our money, we're a bit like, oh fuck. So editorial independence is never an absolute, but the lots of small donations model gives you a sort of political independence. And I think, like, there is, again, to come back to the contradiction, right, and the contradiction of what we do, is that there is a risk that when you set up a successful left-wing media organization, that people go, well, that's all there is we have to do. And so they see their role in the movement as sort of sharing your content. And it means you're still in that trap, to use your word, of sort of like and subscribe, share, follow, et cetera, ironically, the best thing for the left would be the worst thing for Navarra, would be no one's on the internet. But my cat would go so hungry if that was the case.
Et faig una darrera pregunta, perquè, bueno, clar, hi ha una cosa que a nosaltres ens va molt bé escoltar els teus anàlisis i pensar què ens serveix a nosaltres, no? Que al final és una cosa bastant instrumental fins aquí. I penso que també hauríem de poder desmuntar aquesta posició i interessar-nos per què passa en el teu context. I em semblava que si tenim aquesta tarda una analista política britànica d'esquerres, crec que és important interessar-nos per quina és la situació que es dona en el vostre context, que no tenim molt de temps, però et voldria preguntar si ens pots donar el teu punt de vista del que està passant, sabem que hi ha una crisi de govern bastant important per part dels laboristes. Jo t'he sentit dir l'extrema dreta arrasarà i et voldria preguntar com veus i llegeixes el moment que vosaltres teniu per davant i com sents que les esquerres arriben en aquest episodi.
Going on with the UK. I'm like, wow. The far right are probably going to win the next election. Unless something extreme happens, they are going to win the next election. And so there are some political problems that the left is going to have to deal with, which is, on the one hand, yes, we want to break the two-party system. We have a two-party system. You have Labour and the Conservatives, but now really you've got 5 parties. You've got Labour and Conservatives, but then you've got the far-right Reform, you've got a left-wing Green Party, you've got the Liberal Democrats, who no one has ever heard of, but trust me, they exist. And there is a strategic decision that the left has to make. Do you prioritise breaking up the two-party stranglehold on government, but letting in the far right, or do you prioritise blocking the far right, but you're keeping this party duopoly in place? I think that that is the fundamental question that the left has to reckon with. Unfortunately, going back to this question of people wanting to hear what they want to hear, is that I think there is a bit of a narrative on the left at the moment of you can have both. You can vote Green and you can block reform. That's bullshit, right? Like, there is a choice between the two. I think it's legitimate to say, actually, you take the risk of a reform government for one term because the more important thing is to break down that duopoly. But don't pretend that it's not an either or. And I think if there's one thing that I can come back to, which I think we have in common, is that the left is strongest when we are principled and strategic. We are weakest when we are moralizing. And that moralizing way of doing things is a way of trying to take politics out of it. It's a way of trying to take out negotiation, uncertainty, the fact that the conditions, as Marx would say, are not of our own choosing, and trying to say, well, if I feel it to be right, that's enough to make it right. And unfortunately, that's never been what the business of politics is. And I think that the role of discussions like this, of festivals like this, of media projects, of organizing projects, is to try and build that strategic capacity. It doesn't mean you'll always be right, but you'll be wrong less often.
Bé, en el llibre que va publicar Ash Sarkar al context britànic va tenir una segona edició i va tenir un segon epíleg. I Tigre de paper també tradueix en aquest llibre el segon epíleg on l'Ash diu, bueno, vaig publicar el llibre i la gent em va dir, bueno, molt bé, tot molt bé, però què fem? I llavors diu, bueno, em mullo una mica en aquest segon epíleg i llavors jo crec que potser podríem pensar més estructura, no pensar que arribarà un nou cicle polític i anirem surfejant, sinó que l'haurem de treballar, i més connexió humana. I volia acabar dient això, no només per donar-te les gràcies per tota aquesta feina de traducció d'això i de posar-te a escriure un llibre que fa accessible aquestes idees en molts altres contextos, sinó també per agrair molt sincerament la feina de la Fira Literal, que crec que és un dels pulmons del pensament i de la formació política de la nostra ciutat i que crec que l'hem de cuidar entre tots i totes com a un espai on hi ha estructura, hi ha connexió humana, hi ha una capacitat de convocatòria altíssima i per tant que ho recordem, perquè si avui estem parlant amb tu, si aquest llibre està traduït al català, és perquè hi ha moltíssima gent treballant amb això, que ens està fent més sòlids, més empàtics, més complexes, i per tant també volia donar aquest agraïment a aquesta conjugació d'actors que en diversos contextos s'estan organitzant, Novara Media, aquí la Fira Literal i tants altres projectes, i per tant, moltíssimes gràcies a tothom. Gràcies a l'Adrià, que és el nostre intèrpret també, i que tingueu molt bona tarda.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.